Hello everybody, it's great that you all came, and I can welcome you to our first in-person event since the start of the pandemic with the ADH, the Association for the Design of History, and we are an international socialist platform involved in the work of theory, media production and workplace organizing. Today we're happy to have Troy Vettese and Drew Pendergrass as our guests. While Troy is here in person, as you can see, Drew is going to join us via Zoom. The two are going to present the new book, Half of Socialism, a plan to save the future from extinction, climate change and pandemics.
Wahrscheinlich würde ich nicht über alles zustimmen, aber das ist okay. So, ich habe gehört, dass diese Gruppe ein bisschen Prometheus-isch, wie sagt man auf Deutsch, ich weiß nicht, ist, ja. Wir sind nicht Luddite, aber ja, mal schauen, ja. So, ich freue mich auf diese Reden, diese Gespräch und ja, vielen Dank wieder. Aber ich würde auf Englisch reden, weil es ein bisschen einfacher ist. Okay, so, I'm going to be talking mainly about the first chapter of the book, and the first chapter deals with the Promethean side of Marxism, and we're happy to talk about that and debate that. I actually was in Hamburg yesterday, and a couple Fosterites were very angry that I accused Marx of being Promethean, so happy to have it. But I'm sure here that won't happen. But anyways, and then Drew will be talking mainly about the third chapter of the book. So I'll talk a bit about the book itself. What happened was, a few years ago, I wrote an essay for the New Left Review, which you see over here, called Freeze the Thames, and that basically was trying to deal with environmental problems together, so simultaneously. So I was interested in the relationship between renewable energy, extinction, and different kinds of geoengineering. And I argue that these problems are related in terms of land scarcity, and therefore socialists have to take the problem of land seriously. Like either you have land for growing livestock, or you have to use land for biofuels, renewable energy, because it has a low power density. We try to have lots of nature reserves to prevent mass extinction. And then he also wants to avoid having artificial geoengineering or like solar radiation management, and instead have natural geoengineering, as the ecologist Oswald Schmitz calls it, that can sequester lots of carbon. And what we were trying to do with the book is that we're taking these material and policy level level of analysis, and we're adding two other levels. One being a theoretical level to answer what is socialism and what is the relationship between socialism and the environment. And then a technical level, as in how does one actually implement these policies that we were talking about in terms of land scarcity and renewable energy and so forth, and the half-earth as well. And then we actually added a fourth chapter at the last minute, which Drew wrote, which was utopian fiction, because this book quickly became part of the tradition of utopian socialism. So that was the goal of the book. So why did we write this book? We wrote it because we were dissatisfied with the state of the left and the state and the environmental movement, and we were afraid of what's going to happen because what neoliberals are up to. So just to also be clear, I'm an environmental historian. Drew is a scientist. He calls himself an environmental engineer, which I find a little bit confusing. But Drew can talk about what he does, but he deals with programming, artificial intelligence, atmospheric physics, and fun stuff like that. And we worked together, so this was a very fun interdisciplinary book, and we got to complement our strengths, which I'm happy to talk about as well. But we both felt the same way, where we wanted a book that would answer a few questions, such as what was socialism? So again, the left has been in crisis for a long time, definitely since the late 80s or early 90s, if not much earlier. And it wasn't clear what socialism was. What is socialism meant to do? What is socialist democracy? How can socialism avoid certain environmental problems? And now, although there's been a revival of the left in many ways, especially since 2008, to us it's still not clear what socialism is. Lots of it is just nostalgia for 1970s Keynesianism, and we wanted to really think through that. And then we also were not happy with the state of the environmental movement we are very critical in the environmental movement in the book. Even at its most radical in the 1960s and 70s, it still was influenced to a great degree by Malthusianism and had many problems in terms of not caring about environmental justice or being worried about overpopulation. And we do criticize the environmental movement for this, but one can still see it as a relatively independent movement that was critical of capitalism, believed in some kind of economic planning to deal with scarcity of resources, and represented a vibrant grassroots movement. And now, I don't want to turn on this video because it's very painful. I don't know if anyone knows this. This is in Glasgow last year. There was this weird AstroTurf pro-nuclear movement, and they actually did a flash mob in Glasgow saying how much they like nuclear, and it's really terrifying. And I'm showing this because I think you have this environmental movement that was interested in both the environmental problem, but also was pacifist, because it was. I'm sure we'll definitely get into nuclear energy and our differences of opinion on it, but Drew and I are skeptical of it for many reasons, but one of them is political, where we think it's a mistake that pro-nuclear leadership in the Green movement is quite willing to support nuclear power to keep up high living standards while achieving some kind of decarbonization. And this is a mistake because the establishment will never go for this. It has another solution, which we'll get into in a second. And it also is the easiest way to demobilize your base. The nuclear problem is the only thing that really gets reliable majorities. And we think this is a bit foolish in some ways. If you want to check out the video, we can check it out later on. Oh my God, but not now. Oh no. Okay, how do we keep going? Okay, there we go. So, I can't watch that more than once. You can watch it. But anyway, so if that's what the left is basically stuck in some ways, it's not sure what's going on. Again, maybe perhaps the group here is a bit more optimistic about what the left is up to and what it wants. And then we have an environmental movement that, since its peak in the 70s, has been co-opted by the right in many ways. It seeks win-win solutions. It wants to have cap and trade. It wants to have market-friendly policies. It doesn't want to have a direct confrontation the way it did in the 1980s, and it really has become demobilized and unradical. And then we have the neoliberals. So again, this is what I normally study, is neoliberal environmental thought. And what the neoliberals are up to is that they have many policies for controlling the environment or dealing with environmental problems. This is what I do in my work, where I look at cap and trade. One can also look at their relationship to factory farming, or to other policies, like their interest in carbon sequestration and so forth. But and also lots of crazy things in terms of having cap and trade for every kind of problem, whether it's stream restoration or biodiversity offsets and so forth. But they don't really care that these policies don't work very well. They're not really interested in that. What they want is they want to prevent any kind of movement that's capable of actually controlling the economy to attain certain goals. The most important being reducing fossil fuel emissions. So they want to delay any kind of action through climate denial. Then they want to delay action some more by having toothless cap and trade programs, which have had zero effect in actually reducing carbon emissions. And then they want to have geoengineering. So they want to have scientists, entrepreneurs come up with some kind of market-friendly solution to deal with the problem, and not solve it, but at least allow the economy to continue moving, allow capital accumulation to continue happening. And here are just a few of the ideas that they have. Iron fertilization has already been carried out. The most scary in lots of ways is solar radiation management. Drew and I met at Harvard, and Harvard is a real bastion for solar radiation management research, and we both believe that this will probably be implemented within the next 10 years, if not sooner. It's supported by both the Republican Party, by the Democrats. There's a lot of research for it. Bill Gates is a huge funder, and increasingly people are seeing it as inevitable, right? So this is the situation that we're in, and the question is, how do we avoid a future of geoengineering, more inequality, extinction, more pandemics, and so forth? As I think the next 30 years of neoliberal rule are pretty easy to discern, and we need to have some kind of solution. So, again, the book deals a lot with neoliberalism, partially because, again, that's what I study, but I think one can learn from the neoliberals in some ways, whether in terms of how to organize, but also how to reform a movement that is having trouble, that is defunct. I mean, in the 1930s, liberals realized that laissez-faire was dead, that Adam Smith was wrong, and they then dealt with questions of epistemology and tried to rebuild their ideology. And we don't think this has happened for either the environmentalists or the left. So we want to start with some basics, and this is why we return back to the 18th century. So in the book, we have a short intellectual history, and we argue more or less that there's three main ways of understanding environmental problems. They coincidentally emerged in the same year, in 1798. And the first is, the most famous, would be Malthusianism. So Malthus is writing his essay on population as a reaction to William Godwin's previous work from a few years earlier, where he talks about some kind of utopia being created of equality and happiness and the perfectibility of society. And Malthus says, this utopian vision is impossible because people always make more children than the land can support, and they will then impoverish themselves, and inequality is inevitable, famine is inevitable, and so forth. And if anything, you shouldn't help poor people because then they'll make more children and then more people will die overall. So he was also writing against the poor laws a few decades later. But this is this one approach, and this became quite important also for the history of science. Darwin wrote about his theory of evolution after reading Malthus, and that gave him a framework to understand competition within the natural world. And of course, Malthus was very important for environmentalists in the 60s and 70s, and I'm happy to go into that as well, but you can find plenty of environmentalists saying we should let people starve to death because overpopulation is the cause of environmental problems. So that's this, and don't worry, we're not Malthusian, in case you're wondering. The book is really trying to grapple with Malthus and trying to discredit that, to separate the environmental movement from the clutches of this delusional ideology. And if that's the first segment, then the second branch of environmental thought comes from Hegel. And in 1798, Hegel was working on theology, and he started to develop a concept that he would call the humanization of nature. And this was to understand different ways that people related to nature in the Old Testament after the flood. And he was arguing that people saw nature as this would be humanized, and there would be that problem would go away. Marx takes up a lot of this. His understanding of socialism is similarly predicated on the humanization of nature. Both Hegel and Marx, of course, criticize capitalism being this unconscious, uncontrolled distortion of this process, but the idea would be socialism would be a good humanization of nature at some level. And this is where the Prometheanism comes from. So for us in the book, we want to really address Hegel's idea of the humanization of nature and how Marx has used the humanization of nature and pretty much rip it out from Marxist ideology to create a more environmentally friendly or a new socialism that is more compatible with the environmental crisis that we're in. And we draw on a less well-known figure, although maybe he's more well-known now because of the pandemic, but Edward Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine, and he wrote about his challenge trials in 1798 for the Royal Society. What's kind of amazing is that the Royal Society actually refused to publish it. So if you get a paper rejected, don't worry about it too much, because obviously this was really epochal, important research, and he had to self-publish it. And it's, of course, very interesting to understand how he tested and devised the vaccine. But he also, for us, what's most interesting is he has a theory about where disease comes from, right? So he argues that disease comes from people being too close to other animals. And this is an unusual development and it's historical. And because we have grown, as he puts it, too familiar with other animals, we have gotten new diseases. And what's remarkable, of course, is in 1798, no one knew what a bacterium was, no one knew what a virus was, but he was basically correct. So humans did not have communicable diseases before animal domestication. Of course, you had parasites and maybe some other unlovely things, but you didn't have influenza or smallpox or tuberculosis or you name it. All these diseases emerged within the last 10,000 years. And we can get more into how zoonoses are quite important, but and the history of zoonotic disease. But for Jenner, Jenner was important for us because he represents this desire or a critique of humans being too closely intertwined with nature, and therefore some kind of separation from the natural world would be needed to avoid harming ourselves, basically. So these are our three thinkers that we're using to kind of imagine this problem. And our critique of the humanization of nature is that if you're acting in something you don't understand, which one can take from Hegel's own reasoning, then you will cause side effects that you cannot predict because you're acting in ignorance, and these side effects can be quite dangerous. And therefore, the humanization of nature should be careful, should be limited, and one should not strive for the total humanization of nature because there will be more and more side effects that we can't predict, and we have to be careful about this. We talk about the hole in the ozone layer, but I think emerging. It doesn't matter if it's the pet trade or suburbs or medical testing. All these things have caused diseases at some point. So it's also quite fitting poetically to understand the history of the cholera virus. So cholera was a new virus in the 18th century. It used to prey on crustaceans, but then the East India Company emerged and went over to the Ganges Delta in South Asia, and then changed it and developed plantations. And then the cholera bacteria needed a new host because its ecology was disturbed, and then it adapted to survive in human bodies. The first cholera outbreak is in 1817, and a little more than a dozen years later, it slowly marches across Eurasia and reaches Berlin, and then it kills Hegel. So I think this is one way to understand the dangers of the humanization of nature. Don't worry, we're still Marxists, in case you think we're going too far down the Luddite path. We draw, and the book is trying to unite really utopian socialism and Marxism, and I'm happy to talk about that more perhaps in the Q&A. But what we're trying to do is also convert conservationists and environmentalists to think like socialists, right? At the same time as we're trying to convince socialists to give up their Promethean desires and embrace some kind of ecological restraint. So in the book, we draw on the metaphor used in Dialectic of Enlightenment of Odysseus, where, again, in capitalism, no one is in charge. Capital is this inhuman force that is coercive and powerful, and it is forcing humanity into a dangerous direction. And no one is in charge of how we are actually relating to nature, right? Instead, decisions are made based on what's profitable, but capital itself cannot see the world, right? It only sees price signals and rates of profit. So although Odysseus is the master in the situation, he is also bound up, right? And the sirens are representing art and beauty, and the rowers are proletarians who used to be artisans in this metaphor, and instead of enjoying their work or finding beauty in their work, they have to dull their senses and just produce, right? So again, the idea is under capitalism, or capitalism cannot coexist with an ecologically stable society. It needs to constantly expand, right? This is important for us. And this helps us understand what socialism should be, right? So instead of hoping for like a good humanization of nature, we're saying that socialism has to be based on a conscious recognition of the limits of human consciousness at some level, and then aim for a conscious decision to restrain production within planetary boundaries. So this is basically our solution to the first slide of like, what is socialism? What can socialism do? Again, we are pushing the left to give up its Prometheanism. Here's a statue of Prometheus. This is in Chernobyl. That's by the sarcophagus of the old reactor, which is very fitting. But I think also Prometheans forget where the myth of Prometheus comes from. Of course, the Titan steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. And as punishment, the gods send Pandora, and when she opens her box, she releases disease, right? So again, we see this connection between the humanization of nature and zoonotic disease. And I'm not an archaeologist, but my interpretation or my guess would be that there was a living memory of a period before diseases happened, and then once domestication of animals occurs, people recognize diseases started to emerge. And again, Hegel is finding the same thing in terms of his reading of the Old Testament. And my guess is it's a fairly common myth. So I'm obviously talking a lot. I'm going to try to wrap up fairly soon, so Drew can talk. And again, the book is making a plea for humanity to recognize the limits of knowledge, right? So for neoliberals, they're saying the market is unknowable, right? And therefore the market can't be controlled. And then we're saying nature is much more complex than the market. That nature is at some level unknowable. And this might sound like an anti-scientific argument. That's why it was great to work with the scientists on this, so it seems a bit less like that. But I think a scientist would tell you that the more you know about the world, the more you realize you don't understand the world. And I think the left is really enthralled in what Hayek would call scientism, where it thinks that science is about control. It is possible to know everything and to control everything. And we were saying we realize we live in this very fragile biosphere that we have to protect for the sake of other creatures, but also for ourselves. And in terms of illustrating how unknowable nature is, Biosphere 2 is a great example of that. This was an experiment in the early 90s, and it's like a weird mix of having a hippie, environmentalist group of lefties who like Buckminster Fuller and are belonging to a theater troupe, and then they actually have an oil millionaire as one of their members, and who can bankroll this experiment to actually put their ideas of synergy together. And they were trying to understand ecosystems so they could build ecosystems on spaceships and on other planets, right? That's why they're interested in closed systems. So they build this thing, costs $200 million, takes about a hectare of land. They put 8 biospherians inside, and the goal was to have 2-year missions and 50 missions, so as in this would last a century, and they would then understand ecology and be able to replicate the natural world. Very quickly, it began to fail. I try to remember everything that went wrong. I mean, they had a shortage of oxygen and a big spike in carbon dioxide because the concrete reacted with the atmosphere and lowered oxygen levels. So therefore, they actually had to pump in oxygen into Biosphere 2, which completely demolished its utility as an experiment in closed systems. They actually had invasive insects that came along with the plants that they had in there that took over everything. They had a mass extinction. They had all their pollinators died, and they had to pollinate the plants themselves. And what was really strange, and what this picture shows, is that they didn't realize that plants really need wind to stand up straight, and they need some resistance to grow properly. And because there was no wind in this sealed dome, they grew incredibly weak, and lots of them died. Right, and there was algae bloom in the ocean that they had, the ocean biome. So pretty much every possible disaster that we're experiencing now in the environmental crisis occurred within a matter of months here. Other space programs have been working on creating closed systems using simplified ecologies, and it is not worked, even though this has been happening for decades. I think only recently they managed to grow lettuce on the International Space Station. But the point is, knowing nature is quite difficult, and also how do we quantify or how do we give value to nature? If $200 million couldn't keep 8 people alive, what is the value of the Amazon? What is the value of the world, right? Again, I'm just finishing up real quick. So the book is called Half-Earth Socialism. Why is it called Half-Earth Socialism? We are drawn to E.O. Wilson's idea of half-Earth, which is preserving half the world in some kind of nature preserve. This is because there's a very close relationship between mass extinction and land area. And therefore, if we keep on developing and using up most of the world, we can expect close to half the species to go extinct, let alone other drivers of extinction such as climate change or invasive species and so forth. But if you build a half-Earth, then there's a chance that you can stop the Sixth Extinction, which is going on, which is the biggest extinction event since the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. And then there'll be many other benefits, right? I mean, you can actually have you could sequester a huge amount of carbon in these rewilded ecosystems. You would have a cordon sanitaire to prevent the emergence of new zoonoses, and there'll be other benefits. But we disagree with Wilson in many ways, and I'm happy to get into the Q&A. But we also think that this can only happen under socialism, and because of the dynamic of capitalism needing economic growth. I also will say that we liked Half-Earth, and we centered Half-Earth in the title or as our concept because it's talking about other environmental crises. I think lefties like to talk about climate change, but they don't want to talk about other environmental problems. And we think the Sixth Extinction is a really important problem that people should be talking about more, including the left. It also focuses on land scarcity, and then it draws attention to this Generite skepticism, right? This Generite humility that we need to give up ideas of domination, of taking over all of the whole world, and instead restraining ourselves to what can provide the good life for everything, but what also can maintain the biosphere. So, there's another Prometheus, a very different Prometheus, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was subtitled A New Prometheus. And I think it's a very strange book, and there's many ways of reading it, but I think she's both criticizing the old Promethean ideals and suggesting the possibility of a new one. So she, of course, was a utopian socialist herself, and daughter of William Godwin. And she and Percy Shelley both thought that the Prometheus myth was important because it did symbolize this desire for the domination of nature, of eating animals and separating humans from nature based on this change in diet. She and many other utopian socialists were vegetarians, which we find important. And then the story, Frankenstein, was written as a retort to an earlier story written in the 1790s by a French author, where another scientist named Frankenstein makes a perfect mechanical machine that acts as a servant of humanity, and this is a happy story of control. And instead, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you find a ruined, uncontrollable monster that is biological, that is made from the carcasses of proletarians, that cannot be controlled, and will eventually cause misery for his creator. But the monster is also vegetarian as well. And I think here we can imagine maybe she's suggesting we need a new Prometheus that is critical of the old. She also wrote this story when a huge volcanic eruption blocked out the sun and caused the year without a summer in 1816. So she spent that summer in the Alps writing this story instead of holidaying. And that year also saw massive famines. And we're worried that a similar experience will happen to us shortly enough when geoengineers will block out the sun and cause another catastrophe. Thank you very much. So I'll leave it there and let Drew carry on. So Drew, are you there?
I'm here, yep. Do you want to go to the next slide and play this video?
Oh, I can't wait.
Okay, I'm just going to topple this video place, and I'll explain it in a second. It's just a very pretty video, if you don't think about it. So Troy's been talking a lot about Earth history, and I'm going to start 66 million years ago. Everyone probably heard in school about the dinosaurs' extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, where a meteor strikes, and then there's an impact winter where the meteor sends a bunch of residue into the atmosphere. It cools the Earth dramatically by blocking out the sun. Very extreme version of what Mary Shelley and geoengineering would bring us, much more extreme. And this leads to a mass extinction, the fifth mass extinction in Earth's history, caused by this impact. Random fact is that the people who discovered this impact were Louis Alvarez, who had a Nobel Prize in physics, and his son, Walter. But Louis Alvarez was a bit of a jerk and insisted on being the first author on all the papers about the meteorology and took all the credit, even though his son was like a graduate student and was the one who found a lot of this stuff. So anyway, after this extinction, right, we have a warm period. There's sort of two dominant states of the Earth system. Hothouse Earth and Icehouse Earth are what they're often called. Hothouse Earth is basically just the state of the Earth system where there's no ice, no permanent ice on the polar ice caps. So no ice in the Arctic, no ice in Antarctica, no ice top or bottom. And this basically sets up a system that's distinct from our own, a dynamical system that has its own properties. The 55 million years ago or so, there's something called the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, which is the only time in Earth history recently where we have very high levels of CO2 comparable to what we're on track to get. That state had crocodiles in the Arctic, for example, is very warm throughout. But we're not on track in IPCC reports to get something like that because we are in an icehouse Earth state where we do have caps on ice in the north and the south. So that transition happens something like 33 million years ago where ice begins to form and we're in this new state. So I'm saying all these random details for you just to give you a sense that the Earth system is very complex, very dynamic, where depending on those dynamics, you can get very different outcomes. If you're in a hot ice or Earth state, you have very different outcomes than when you're in an icehouse Earth state. And this video here is very interesting. So what I'm showing here is projections for the next 10,000 years. So often when we talk about climate change, we only talk about human-caused climate change, at least. We only talk about climate change, by 2100 or something. This paper, I found out about it when I was reading the new assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a paper in Nature, and it makes the argument that if current levels of warming, so 1 degree of Celsius above pre-industrial levels, continue for roughly 60 years, the Amundsen ice shelf, which is an ice shelf in Antarctica, will be destabilized enough that it will set us on an irreversible path to transition Antarctica to Western Antarctica to an ice-free state, meaning that this perturbation to this dynamical system will lead to irreversible ice loss. And that's what this video is showing. Now, of course, this is over 10,000 years. We will all be long gone by then. But I think it's really interesting illustration of an irreversible large-scale change in the Earth system that would put us on track for a hothouse Earth state, for example, because if you get rid of these ice caps, you have this big dynamical transition, and that would be irreversible no matter what humans do. There's just no way out of that path. But this is very long-term, right? This is not going to worry us or our descendants anytime soon. There are much more urgent climate change matters. So next slide. So, and another thing that we don't really have to worry about, probably. Hopefully we don't have to worry about this. But another illustration of this nonlinear dynamics is the branch of math that I'm talking about here. This is dominant in the Earth system. Here, I'm showing a new paper from Tapio Schneider, who's climate science rock star at Caltech. And this paper is very interesting. It holds that in the simple model that Schneider and his group ran, if you have high levels of CO2, 1,600 parts per million, I think, something like that is when he observes this transition. The radiative effects of carbon dioxide radiates in the infrared spectrum. That's why it is a greenhouse gas. If you reach a certain accumulation of CO2, then you cause this effect where spontaneously you have a phase change where stratocumulus clouds in the tropics no longer can form because of these radiative effects of this warming in this mid-level of the troposphere. So what does that mean? Okay, so the Earth has a radiative balance, right? Where we receive light from the sun, we reflect some light back out in terms of the albedo effect, like ice reflects light, clouds reflect light, and there are other feedbacks as well that control the Earth's radiative balance, the light coming in, light going out, energy in, energy out. And that radiative balance determines the climate. So if you lose, in terms of the breakup, your stratocumulus cloud decks in the tropics, you're losing a very large source of albedo, a very large source of reflecting that light that's been coming into the Earth back out of the Earth system. And if you do that, then you spontaneously get roughly 10 degrees Celsius of global warming, well beyond anything in the most worst case IPCC scenarios. And 1,600 parts per million, by the way, is very large. We're not going to get there. It's very implausible that we would get that much warming. But it's interesting because of what's called a hysteresis, which is what I titled this section. Hysteresis meaning a state in a nonlinear system determined by its past. Once you go through this transition, it cannot be undone until you get well below pre-industrial levels of CO2, until you get to around something like 250 or so parts per million of CO2, much lower than we have any plausible way of getting. So once this transition happens, it can't be undone. You can't just go back below 1,600 parts per million, the thing that got you your transition. This sort of dynamic is extremely common in the Earth system. It's common in any nonlinear dynamical system. So, but again, probably don't have to worry about this, although we don't actually know where this boundary would be. So we don't actually know for sure if it would be 1,600 parts per million. Let's hope it's that high up. But this is not a feedback that we should really worry about. There are much more worrying feedbacks like ice loss. Next slide. Okay, a feedback that should be worrying, like a hysteresis, where we have a dynamical transition that cannot be undone, is the loss of tropical forests. So tropical forests have exhibit these nonlinear dynamical effects because a lot of the rain in the rainforest comes from the rainforest itself. Forests generate their own precipitation to some extent. It's called recycled precipitation, where the water released by the forest itself goes on to form clouds and cycles that water. This paper is associated with Johan Rockström, who's rock star in sustainability world, who really does a lot of work on this sort of these hystereses, these transition periods. So you have stable forests have a good amount of forest cover. You have to have enough trees and a certain climate stability. Now, if you go to an intermediate climate, meaning a warmer climate, using the language of this paper, there's a bistability. So that's this yellow little surface on the left here, where we have two little divots. There's a divot for 2 levels of forest cover. So you can kind of be in 2 stable states in this intermediate climate situation, where you have high levels of forest cover and low levels of forest cover, and these both are stable states. The implication here is that a forest like the Amazon rainforest might be in the decreasing forest cover bistable state. We're cutting down the Amazon rainforest very rapidly. Most of this deforestation, if not all, has happened since 1990, age of the world market. Plus climate change, we're entering this yellow zone. The problem is that The only stability with low forest cover is state number 4, where there is transition to a savanna, where you have a rainforest transition quite rapidly over the scale of a human lifetime to a savanna ecosystem. The Amazon rainforest is on track, if this deforestation continues, to transition to a savanna, which will release a very large amount of carbon dioxide and kill off one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. So next slide. Why have I belabored this point so much? I worry that I talk too much about this, but why belabor this? This is sort of, I think, the insight of where planning comes in half-earth socialism. We make the case for planning in our book. In the 3rd chapter of the book, we go deep into planning because the Earth system, as Troy has illustrated very well, is extremely complex, very unknowable, and has a tendency to start down transitions that cannot be undone. So this diagram is from a National Academy of Science paper in the US that kind of has this hothouse Earth and icehouse Earth that I was talking about earlier. And he's talking about this in a different sort of sense than I was earlier, in this more formal, like, ice cap presence definition that I was using earlier. But the idea here is that as time goes on, which is the kind of dimension towards us, and we get further into this Anthropocene, if we want to use that term, and we are perturbing the environment more and more and more, we'll be entering into this bistability, this stability away from the pre-industrial or the climate biodiversity system before we had all these perturbations, and we may not be able to get back out. So time for action and constraining the Earth between these planetary boundaries is extremely important, because while there's always going to be things to save and things to intervene, the longer you wait and the more of these boundaries you perturb, the more likely it is that you'll not be able to get back to where you started. The more likely it is that you'll have these transitions that begin that cannot be undone. It's quite likely that we are locked into that West Antarctic ice sheet collapse 10,000 years from now, but still locked in. So this is an important thing to just be aware of. And this is what motivates planning under half-earth socialism. So let's go ahead 2 slides. Maybe I can come back to these numbers in a second. One more slide. So I just want to illustrate this, and I'm going to come back to this figure in a second. This is the original OG dynamical system plot from Lorenz, and then Ellen Fetter ran the model. Lorenz was trying to simulate a very simple climate system where you had a simple set of coupled partial differential equations. And he found that the system was chaotic, meaning that slight changes in the initial conditions led to very different outputs. This is fundamentally why weather is hard to predict. Weather is a complex system. It exhibits chaos. So to make an accurate weather forecast, you need to have accurate initial conditions. Otherwise, your forecast will be wrong. That's why you can't really make a weather forecast beyond 48 hours and expect any degree of accuracy. And I like to think of the job of socialism in a warming world and a world of mass extinction, the first mass extinction since that 66 million year ago event, is to govern ourselves on a trajectory that's chaotic. Like, we're in this dynamical system. This Lorentz attractor is what it's called. It has 2 stable orbits around these, or they're not really stable, but two kind of configurations around these 2 centers. We need to make sure we stay in the safe one, in the one where we evolved, where life on Earth evolved, and don't make these transitions that cannot be undone. So next slide. So this is where this Benjamin line, Walter Benjamin line, I find to be very apt. Troy, you're rotating me. Is there any?
Oh, nope, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I was I was doing good. Okay, so Benjamin has this line that's very good in my view. Marx said that the revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps things are very different. Maybe revolutions are the act by which the human race traveling in the train applies the emergency brake. The emergency brake for us is this half-earth socialist system where we take very seriously these challenges of living on a chaotic Earth system that we have been perturbing dramatically, that sustains us, that makes life possible. And we need to be very, very careful that we do not push things to an instability that we cannot control. So how do we control the Earth system? Next slide. So we, one of our kind of slogans in the book is that you can either try and plan nature, or you can try and plan the economy. Meaning that the future of the 21st century will be geoengineering of some kind to try and plan nature, or planning the economy in order to direct the Earth system away from these unpredictable transitions. So this is sort of our politics of self-restraint, our idea that we need to plan the economy within these boundaries. So next slide. I'll try and go quick because I think we both talked way longer than
Sorry.
we meant to. During the German Revolution, one of a short-lived socialist experiment, lasted about a month before the Free Corps, supported by the SPD, took it down. And an interesting person who was involved in planning this was a guy named Otto Neurath. Next slide. Neurath was a polymath from Vienna, one of the many very interesting people that comes out of Red Vienna. He's really a fascinating person. He's an economist. He's a philosopher of science. He's an economic historian, a war planner. He was involved in war planning during World War I. And he was appointed head planner of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. And he has he has a lot of interesting ideas. We engage with him quite closely in the book. But the idea that he that we run with is this idea of scientific utopias being a key part of socialist governance. The idea here is that utopias are an important political act, because in talking about the future and talking about the plans that we as a society would like to consciously self-govern ourselves by, in the process of thinking about what we want the future to be, we might come up with several blueprints or scientific utopias for the future. And by that he means like plausible portraits of a future that reflects a certain set of values. We would produce a diversity of these, and then we would decide together which path we would like to go down. And the idea in that constructing these scientific utopias, you're dealing very concretely with reality, with your limits, but you also acknowledge that those limits are socially constructed to some degree. There's no, when we're drawing lines about where we want the limits of consumption to be, there's no a priori, like, that's definitely where we should draw the line. It can be informed by scientific study and other forms of reason, but it's ultimately going to be a value-based decision. So there's this element of socialist democracy going on. And that's where we kind of see our book, Half Earth Socialism, is working on two levels. We're both kind of proposing that socialist democracy kind of works with this Neurath framework, and then we're proposing our scientific utopia of what we want the future to be, and we make the case for it. But we want there to be a plurality of utopias out there, and that's why we made this video game. The video game's purpose is to experiment with basically every idea out there in the environmental world, in terms of both things we agree with and things we don't agree with. You can do all sorts of different energy mixes, different policies, different forms of self-restraint, so long as you can get parliament on your side, global parliament on your side. And then you can experiment for yourself and see what pathways there are out of the environmental crisis. There are several, and these paths have different consequences both on the biosphere and on our standards of living and other aspects, and on equality and all these different things that we might want to think about in terms of designing the future. So let's go on to the next slide. I should have shown this slide while I was talking about this. Neurath also thought that this sort of, transparency or clarity was important. So Neurath wanted to make, after this revolution was crushed, he kind of turned into a bit of a museum curator / graphic designer. And he developed this picture language called isotype. And the idea with isotype was to make clear the functioning of the economy, the material functioning of the economy for everyone, including people who couldn't read, so that they could be a part of deciding what we want the future to be. And we consider this game to be in this tradition of Otto Neurath, where rather than saying, "Oh, we just need to let the market sort it out," or "We need to let the blind market forces solve all of our problems for us," we need to see for ourselves what these problems are, what these trade-offs are. And I can show those very complicated-looking graphs that I skipped over, which have to do with the challenges and trade-offs involved in getting our emissions down to zero. Unfortunately, even if you don't like what we're saying, there's going to be extremely hard decisions that have to be made, even if you don't care about biodiversity and you only care about climate. There's no easy way out of this challenge that we're in. And I think we should open up for questions. I can talk more in the question and answer section about how we envision Neurath's blueprints being implemented. Neurath gets taken down by the neoliberals, by Ludwig von Mises, in part because he has no plausible way of identifying how one might produce these blueprints or how they might be enacted. So we go into that and take that on in the third chapter of the book. But
so should we do some Q&A and then maybe show the game after or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do. Also, okay. So let's see Drew's face. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. I don't know how do we look just at Drew? Is there a way to do that?
You can click the three dots over on your picture.
On my picture.
Self-view.
Okay, here we go. Okay, questions.
I feel like I'm too big.
You're huge. This big brother is looking down. Yeah. Yeah, questions. Who likes vegan socialism? Who's like, I don't know. Please, what? Yeah, good. Wow.
You can turn on the light.
Please.
Oh.
Okay.
Energy usage.
Yeah.
Increased.
I mean, the book covers lots of things. We just went over things very quick. We're happy to explain things, or happy if people disagree. Or if everyone agrees, we can just go home and eat dinner.
Yeah, maybe I want to.
Please, yeah.
So I had to, and then like generism, let's call it.
Yeah.
Like the ideas of Jenner. But then also in the end you said like, you also think about socialist planning, and then of course planning is needed to do these half-earth transformations which you suggest. And so for me, I would say that this planning the environment or planning the economy, that this is Promethean idea. So I would ask you maybe to clarify more, like what is the distinction? Clarify more, like what is the distinction between
that goes into making an ecosystem, whether it's the temperature of the water, or how many insect, larvae are there, or what's the bird population, or and actually you do want it to meander, but not too much, and and there's a very nice critique, and we draw, there's a very nice engagement, and she's another scholar who works on neoliberal environmental thought, and she's looking at these basically like a market for stream restoration, and she works with an ecologist, and they basically say, either you can go after a certain metric and achieve one thing that you think is important, or you have to do a restoration and you just don't know what's going to happen. Like there's at some level, like maybe it'll work and maybe something, you don't know what species are going to show up and so forth, but you have to rely on the ecosystem repairing itself. There's only so much you can do. And with this is, in terms of half-earth, is like, there's obviously work in terms of removing invasive species, or to remove dams, or all this kind of stuff, to reintroduce apex predators, but you also are looking at a landscape that isn't fully controlled by human consciousness. Like we don't see human consciousness reflected back at us. We talk about But I mean, as in like, that's great if Prometheans want to make half Earth. But for us, we think it's quite a different vision of what our relationship to nature should be and how we engage. The point is, we rely on something we don't understand, and we have to figure out a way to stabilize it and use science, but also realize there are limits to our knowledge at the same time, if that makes sense. Drew, I don't know if you want to add. Did you hear the question?
I heard the question. I'll just add briefly that maybe I would think that like we're maybe Promethean in terms of our the belief in the capacity of humanity to govern itself and maybe self-restraint, right? I think we do have some, we could be called utopian in that sense.
We're definitely utopian, yeah. We're
very proud of that label, but we think that humanity can govern itself and economic democracy can be enacted, and that we don't need to rely on impersonal market forces to coordinate the economy. And to that extent, I think, we believe in the capacity of humanity to do that. So we are Promethean in that extent, but I suppose we draw the boundaries of human reason. Just can't control, don't understand, and the prospects of messing it up are extremely risky.
And to be clear, I mean, we wrote this book, for ourselves to understand, like, why are we in this mess? Why are things so fucked, right? And then looking at what would it actually look like to get over it, right? What would we actually need to do? And that was just out of our own curiosity, right? We were like, what needs to be done so we're not constantly living through more crises and actually achieve some kind of equality and so forth. And so the book is not interested in immediate feasibility. I mean, also, if no one likes the book, oh well, Drew and I learned something. But I mean, we think it's useful to not be practical at some level, to understand what you believe and understand the world and then develop a way to see the world and have a framework. And then from there, you can multiply policies and things to do and see allies and so forth. Because we're saying the left and the environmental movement, they lack that. They don't have a framework. And we're learning from neoliberals and saying, once they kind of figured out what they believed in, then they were able to act in the world, right? And so we're because in 1947, no one took them seriously, of course, right? And we think that, again, if it's not our ideas, it'd be nice if they were, but we want there to be a discussion about what the left wants to achieve and what environmentalists want to achieve.
Maybe in relation to that, the question while reading the book that I asked myself is, can you basically have the entire book without the first chapter? So to say okay,
it's my chapter.
Yeah, but to say okay, why the philosophical foundation? Is that really necessary? Or if people might not agree with that philosophical foundation, okay, all of the stuff you write about solar radiation management, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, the half-life project, and your chapter on planning, that okay, you can agree with all of that without having to have this philosophical foundation. And if you say okay, no, you can only really make the argument for basically this half-life project and for the planning if you also have this philosophical foundation.
I mean, I'm sure Drew and I are thinking the same thing, but as Drew was saying, the book does two things, right? It's like the left and environmentalists should think of these total plans, we know they're called total plans, and then have a variety of plans. Like, what do we want? Because I think right now we have very stupid debates, right? We're like, I'm a flexitarian, or I have an electric car, and does any of that matter? Who knows? No one knows, right? Because we're just autonomous consumers in a market society. No one knows what it adds up to. We have no way to think about that. And then what we want is people to kind of present their total plans. Like, if everyone had this much energy use, if we produce this much energy, if we had this extinction rate, if we had this much livestock, we can expect this many zoonotic diseases, then what do you think about that? Is that a society you want to live in, right? So again, you can completely disagree with us and say, I want nuclear, I want geoengineering, I want even more meat for everyone. And then what are the costs, right? And but my point, so that's one step. And the other step is the step is, what we're saying is what, looking at that, we've come up to our own conclusions. So I think the Neuratian part is the total plan. So I think most of the discussion amongst the left is really like some kind of market socialism, which I think is not super clear in terms of what plans we want and how we decide upon what futures we want. So I think that's useful, but one doesn't necessarily, obviously Neurath wasn't a vegan, energy quota planner, right? So it's not necessarily connected. Drew, what do you think?
I'd also add that Neurath did kind of win an argument against Mises in terms of Mises concedes that capitalism will have a lot of environmental problems. But that doesn't mean that Neurath was an environmentalist. It doesn't seem like it was a set of ideas that really meant anything to him. So yeah, I guess in that sense, there's sort of a pragmatic versus a philosophical division, where the pragmatic element is what really matters. This sort of debates that are grounded and have broad visions and are very creative, and we can interplay there. That's what really matters. Yeah, I wouldn't want to draw hard lines around the philosophy, as that would be a silly reason not to be in solidarity with a group.
I will also say Neurath himself said this kind of total planning, it doesn't need to be a socialist state. It could be like a military authoritarian state could also engage in total planning. I mean, he was like, this is just an approach. I mean, it emerged from war planning, right? So that's where you get to that. Any other questions?
Yeah. And each time you just pick the step that's the most profitable for your stakeholders. In socialism, you don't have this, and I'm really interested in varieties of metrics that you would want to maximize. And I'm curious if you have ideas of terminal goals, in the context of environmentalism, that you would want to either maximize or satisfy to a certain extent.
Sure.
Yeah, this is a good question. So, in the third chapter of the book, we have this have this idea of Neurath's scientific utopias, total plans, but he doesn't really have a way of realizing them. And then we say that, Leonid Kantorovich in 40s, 50s, 60s, in this sort of linear programming branch of kind of Soviet economic reform, this sort of optimization branch, was a way to, in practice, go from a plan to a set of quotas or to a set of shadow prices that could realize that plan in practice. But we point out some shortcomings with linear programming in the book. It's relative inflexibility, some problems with information, problems of hierarchy, nested models, like how much detail do you get at each level of aggregation of control. And so we go on to talk about additional ways of managing the economy. We go through Project Cybersyn in Chile. We talk a little bit about some environmental regulations in the 1980s in Siberia, and we end with some preliminary outlines on how tools developed to manage chaotic systems in the real world. So tools for weather forecasting, where you're trying to accumulate global information, use it to update a global model, how that could be marshaled in the service of building socialism. But your point was a point about, the sort of maximizing things. So what functions might you want to maximize? So in the book, we do have a little toy linear program to demonstrate how this mathematical method, which is an optimization method where you have what's called an objective function, a function that you want to maximize or minimize, and that function with constraints is what determines quotas or shadow prices or whatever in this sort of planned system. So we have in the book, in our toy example, we try various objective functions like minimizing carbon emissions, minimizing land use, subject to constraints that are determined by this group. So that's one sense of the answer to your question, but I think that's quite narrow. The what you're getting at there a little bit was this sort of micro element of you have individual actors who are each optimizing themselves, and this leads to some economic structure emerging. So I think we're still thinking about maybe the more micro element versus this macro element, where how can you have a system where firms or actors or whatever kind of fit into this broader plan. That's something that we're still thinking about, I think, a little bit, but we talk about it a little bit in the book, where we have this hope that if everyone contributes and participates in the formation of the plan and in how it's enacted, and are given a wide variety of independence, that can help with the problems of motivation, but that link between macro and micro, I think we're still thinking about.
This is kind of like your work on Cornai, right? Where not everything's not going to work great. Socialism is probably going to lead to some shortages and all that. Like, it can do some things well, for sure. Like, in terms of like total organization or achieving certain consciously decided goals, it probably does that much better than capitalism, right? But and then the whole debate between Neurath and Mises is do you want to have a single metric for rationality, or is that irrational or pseudo-rational, right? And we agree with Neurath, where if you have a single metric, it will always end up with pseudo-rationality. So, again, in my other work on neoliberal environmental thought, it's really like a few different ways to think about the problem of externality, right? Like, you can either be a neoclassical economist and say we need to have taxes or subsidies to internalize the externality. A neoliberal would say we need to create markets to internalize that externality. And then a socialist would say you need to plan at a big enough scale, right? And this is where Coase, who's an important neoliberal, gets his idea and his theories of the firm, where he's looking at Dobb and Lenin and Neurath talking about under socialism you would try to operate the economy as if it were a single firm. So obviously, it's true. He's saying that there'd be different levels of planning at that level. But I think with trying to figure out what are the goals you want. Do you care about your mercury pollution? Do you care about how long your workers are working? You would decide collectively what are the metrics you care about, and then you would try to use linear programming or these cybernetic methods to figure out a plan that works best. And then you could compare different plans at that point. But it's probably going to take a lot of meetings, to figure that out. I want to hear some pro-Promethean pushback. I was told to be ready. But, again, I was given a hard time by this Foster guy yesterday. He was really grilling me, and I want something. Hey, Foster, right? Come on.
What was this?
We can also always show the game. Sorry, was someone starting to talk?
Someone who likes John Bellamy Foster. He's an eco-socialist who says Marx is great. He loved animals because he had a pet dog, and really, and the Prometheanism isn't real. He actually was very ecological, and so you don't need a new theory. It's all Marx.
Okay, maybe it isn't really a pro-Promethean point. It's rather it's basically kind of like a clearing up question about this generism, this like ecological skepticism, and this idea, okay, nature can never fully be known, but we have science, we know nature at least like partially, and my question is basically this question of how much can nature be known. Okay, we have some kind of scientific and technological progression throughout history. That one would say, okay, the degree to which nature can be known and therefore justifiably be intervened in without having like too much of a risk of disastrous side effects increases according to like, not like automatically throughout history, but like, okay, increasing to the development of science. And okay, one could say, okay, therefore over time with the development in science and our technical capacities, we can also humanize nature more and more, because we reduce the risk for side effects. And I mean, basically, as far as I know, basically nothing more is what Prometheanism itself says. It doesn't say, okay, we can automatically control nature. It says, okay, we need this time, we need the scientific and technological capacity for that, but there is no human condition limit or some essential characteristic to nature or human knowledge which would put a hard limit somewhere. Okay, there's the limit, you cannot go over this. And there I don't really see the difference between what you are basically proposing and just saying, okay, this is kind of the limit, doing stuff like geoengineering is just over the limit of our current knowledge and really technical capacities to minimize risks, and therefore we shouldn't do it. And yeah, where really is the difference to
I think Foster and those kind of eco-socialists, and I think
because we come from this left accelerationist background, we're not really this eco, but
you don't have to know him.
Something like Brassier and Negorestani, this kind of more the philosophical Promethean is not maybe to give some kind of context. Maybe.
Sure. I mean, I think, or just general 20th century socialist Prometheanism. I think they believe that a good socialist humanization of nature is possible, some kind of reasonable, consciously conducted humanization, and then nature could be completely transformed. And the Frankfurt School is like this, which is kind of bizarre for me. I mean, I would say geoengineering is a good example where you can't create that knowledge until you act. And Drew can speak more to this, right? As in, geoengineers, they almost at some level don't know what to do right now. They get $20 million a year to work on their research, and they have some models, and they're trying to get some baseline data, but really they just want to start doing it. Because the system is so complex, they can't understand what their effects will be. So as in, there's no potential to have experiments, really, right? It's impossible. So you can't carefully collect knowledge. You can only act. You can only change it. And then, so I would say these kinds of problems are examples of where it is impossible to fully know nature without causing harms. I think zoonotic disease is a good example as well. There was the PREDICT program, which was a global program to try to detect new diseases emerging before they became an epidemic, right? And they found lots of diseases. But you have billions of animals and billions of people over billions of hectares. You're not going to find every disease before it comes out. I mean, that's just impossible, right? So, where do we draw the line? That is something we can debate. Now, again, we're saying science can't tell us where it is. Maybe it's half Earth. Maybe it's 40% Earth. Maybe it's 2/3 Earth. Who knows, right? But I think it's still. What we're contributing is this, philosophy of knowledge. We're saying we cannot hope to reach a point of fully knowing nature. That is beyond us. It's never going to happen at some level, and socialists should give it up. And therefore, what do we know? What can we hope to know matters? I'll say one last thing about, John O'Neill writes about this. He's a nice philosopher who works on Neurath and other eco-socialist problems. But and this is also, I forget if it's in Marx or Hegel, but there's different approaches of science, right? We're trying to learn about the world without causing so much damage. And my guess is there's differences, as I say, in ornithology between trying to kill lots of birds and see what happens, which happens, which is there's some really terrifying experiments, versus trying to be patient and observe what happens in nature, right? Those are different kinds of sciences, and maybe it produces different kinds of knowledge, but you're still not going to get all the knowledge. But what does the scientist say?
I liked that distinction, Troy, between certain kinds of trying to govern the Earth system at a very large scale cannot be experimented with on a small scale. They have to be done through action. So this sort of geoengineering experiment thing where action kind of has to replace knowledge to some degree. You can release a small amount of stuff in the stratosphere and see how the chemical reactions are, but you can't test all the various conditions. Our models of the stratosphere are very bad. and you could, and we don't know what the feedbacks might be. So there's some amount of, so your models and your small scale experiments are not going to be able to add up to the knowledge that would be produced from actually going and doing it. So there's sort of large scale trying to direct the Earth system that I think, like, formally, theoretically cannot be part of science. But your question, I think, was getting at something else, which was, surely we have learned things about nature, like we definitely have. And surely that knowledge has increased and will continue to increase, and that's undoubtedly true. And I would say I agree, but I think that the line in terms of what that knowledge allows us to intervene in is drawn very close in. It's not very far out because of the complexity of the system you're working with. So, for example, there's this interesting experiment that's been going on for the past 30 years, a little bit west of me in Massachusetts, where they buried some nichrome heating cables, so same stuff that's in a toaster, and they've been heating the soil in this forest 5 degrees Celsius above background for the past 30 years. The goal is to see how does a terrestrial forest respond to climate change. And this experiment's already not perfect because you're heating only a small patch of soil, not a large-scale forest, because the forest is all interconnected. But you can at least get an idea for what the soil is going to do. And the soil had a period of releasing a large amount of carbon dioxide, basically because these microbes get supercharged and they eat a lot of stuff and belch out carbon. And then it levels off. And the scientific interpretation was, okay, this is sort of to be expected, there's some stability that's been reached. And then they started emitting more carbon again, like 20 years into the experiment. So it looked like there was a stability, and then there was this unpredictable, this theoretically resolved pattern of emitting more CO2. And then, you can revise your models, and you're like, okay, well, maybe they evolved to consume recalcitrant carbon that's locked away. And then they stopped emitting again, so the models were thrown out again. And so this is an interesting pragmatic problem, which is, so it's not a formal philosophical reason why we can't know about nature, but this is a small-scale experiment that's been going on for 30 years, and that it continues to yield new, interesting results. It's hard to generalize because it's a patch of forest, so you didn't heat the forest as whole, and you only heated the forest in one region. You didn't hit tropical forest. There have been experiments in northern Sweden that heat oil forests, like colder forests, that's similar. But it's a pragmatic problem because this sort of long-term ecological research, which has been funded by the US government for a while, takes a very long time to yield results, and the results aren't always very actionable, and the generalizability is in doubt. They're useful and interesting, but how much control you can then exert on nature as a result of this knowledge, I would be very skeptical of. So there's, I guess, pragmatic, and then there's some cases where there's a theoretical problem.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that epistemology is a good way to start. As in, what can you know? And I think when you start with that question, then you can say, okay, what is the realm of politics? Where can we act? And I think if you avoid that, or you think everything's knowable, it leads to a simplistic politics. I mean, you look at neoliberals who are very sophisticated, ruthless actors, versus like neoclassical economists who aren't interested in questions of knowledge, right? You can't compare the two. And then, again, about your point about knowing things, in like 1492, when they discovered, when Europeans crossed the Atlantic and all that, at that moment, Europeans thought we were so close to knowing everything. We will soon know all of nature, right? And then, obviously, since 1492, we've given up that conceit, right? And I think it's, again, the more you know, the more you realize how ignorant you were before. So I'm skeptical of it. Any other questions? Or should we wrap up soon? Or please.
I'm happy to show the game for the last little bit.
Okay, we have another question.
Yeah, of course.
If it's still possible to have the game after that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, sure. About the Half-Earth project, I think what makes me concerned would be how feasible is it actually to put a large fixed amount of the Earth under protection, while simultaneously keeping a decent living standard and improving living standard for
all the poor people in the world, or a large population, given the constraints that we already have. Like we already have droughts, we already have famines, and if you don't like nuclear energy, you also need place for solar and wind parks, and so on and so forth. Malthusianism.
So this is why in the book, like again and again, if you kind of look at models or studies on land use, they'll tell you these things are all impossible to achieve. Like you can't have agriculture without fossil fuels because you rely on fertilizers and pesticides and so forth. You can't have organic agriculture. Or you don't have space for biofuels or BECCS or whatever you want, unless you get rid of the animal industry, animal husbandry, right? Once you get rid of that, suddenly you have 4 billion hectares of land, and that's the size of 4 Canadas. That's the largest use of land we have for any industry. And then once you have that, then suddenly you have space for renewable energy, you have space for parks, you have space for carbon sequestration and so forth, like natural carbon sequestration. So I mean, because otherwise I think you're right. Otherwise, like it's very hard to, if you don't have veganism, it's extremely hard to achieve any of these goals, right? And that's why we're already seeing people trying to put solar panels in national parks, and then they have some tortoise go extinct or whatever it is, right? You're making trade-offs somewhere, right? And what we're saying in the book is socialism. This is a Neuratian point. Socialism is making the economy visible. I mean, he had those exhibitions because he wanted the working class to see the economy and then imagine running the economy, controlling the economy. And that's why neoliberals say the economy is unknowable, right? Because they were scared of that. So if we can see that, we can see what trade-offs we want. And then this is why also, with the model that Drew made, you can say, okay, how are we going to make, what's the carbon emissions? Are we going to use nuclear? Are we going to, what's the energy quota we're going to have? How much land are we going to use for biofuels? Do we have to get rid of cars? You can have those debates, right? We stress that Malthusianism is a really horrible ideology. Now, the end point of that is eco-fascism, and we're trying to pull environmentalists away from that, because I think it's still at some level the default ideology for them. But obviously it's not going to be easy, but veganism is one way to solve a lot of those problems.
Troy, can you put the slides back up on the screen and show slide number 24?
No, I didn't. I should have looked at it. Let me see.
It's the one, it's back a few, it's
I see it.
A bar plot. Yeah. Okay, so this is, I'll just use this to kind of, as an illustrative point. Yeah, so Troy's right, 77% of agriculture lands are used for animal products, so pasture, but also the vast majority of, the most common use of soy and corn is not for people or for tofu, it's for feeding animals. And so that is a problem that takes up a huge amount of land, 40 million kilometers squared of land for livestock, meat, and dairy, provides very little calories. It mostly goes to the rich. And this needs to be confronted when we have these challenges. So let's take, aside from the half-earth problem, this problem kind of comes up in our Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So this is the 2018 1.5 degrees Celsius report that I'm showing here. And this is a figure from the second chapter. This is talking about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage BECCS. You grow trees, you burn them, you capture the carbon artificially, you bury that underground. The idea is it's a negative emission technology because the trees take up carbon as they grow, and then you capture the carbon and bury it into the lithosphere. And so this is various scenarios. Actually, can you go one slide before this? Okay. So this is our path to net zero. that people talk about, activists talk about. The bottom 4 plots I think are interesting. These are 4 different scenarios for paths to net zero. There's the low energy use scenario at the left, which is the IPCC scenario that's most in line with what we propose in the book. It involves only carbon uptake on, from reforestation, from rewilding, no other means. And then the other scenarios are basically slower decarbonization scenarios that have various levels of higher energy use. The right one is the one we're most on track for if we do take seriously getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius, scenario 5. Scenario 5 is that you have carbon emissions reductions starting in 2020, but they're small reductions. Actually, in fact, carbon emissions have continued to increase. So we're not on track for scenario 5. We're still increasing about 1% per year with a dip in 2020. But if you wait until like 2030 to rapidly slow down, even though you've already started slowing down, then you end up with, next slide, getting to 1.5 degrees requires 3 Indias worth of land to be put into these bioenergy plantations. The land problem will emerge even if you don't take biodiversity seriously. So regardless of whether the half-Earth is considered, this will be a major source of conflict and debate in the 21st century if we do, act for this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And you can see in all these plots, there's a significant decrease in pasture. So even if you, there's no goals here in saving biodiversity. This is only a climate paper. This is only climate goals. If you care about the biodiversity, you're going to probably need more rewilding. But then you have that brown line in the previous slide. That's the agricultural, another land use line where you get negative emissions there from afforestation. So this is just a lot. I talked a lot here, but it's a very powerful question. The question of is this feasible is the question that we want socialists to be asking and environmentalists to be asking, thinking in big picture. The answer that we usually come to in the book is yes, but it requires sacrifices.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing is biofuels are extremely crap in terms of power density, right? Like, you need a huge area to replace fossil fuels. So the question then becomes, how fast can electrification happen, or do we have to just force, public transit, that kind of thing? And then the other thing is that, again, if you have veganism, suddenly the amount of land humans need is not that big, right? So it makes, the amount of land we actually need is whatever, I forget what we came up with, but it was like 10% or something like that. So then it frees up a lot of things. And then the question becomes, what is the energy quota you want, and how quickly can you electrify? And so, but you actually can achieve all these goals. I mean, basically you have a problem which is, you have 3 things. You have energy use, biodiversity, and high population, and you can only really do 2 of these things, right? So either you have some kind of energy quotas and to preserve biodiversity and high population, but like a Malthusian would say, I want my high energy use, so I'll get rid of population, right? And then like a Promethean socialist would say, I want high population and high energy use, screw biodiversity. So we have to choose at some point, right?
And I'll just quickly jump in and clarify a couple things. When we say the half-Earth, we talk at length in the book about the history of conservation, the negative history of conservation, and we make the point that biodiversity is higher on indigenous managed land. Indigenous managed lands absorb much more carbon than other forms of land. So the land back movement and alliances with indigenous struggles is part of the half-Earth program. So I'll add that. And then the other thing I'll add is on a point of nuclear is that when the book, we're reacting to proposals to build very large amounts of nuclear plants very rapidly, which is
James Hansen's plan.
That's the Hansen proposal, which is with existing technology not really possible. With new nuclear proposals, maybe it could be possible, but there are lots of problems with them, like liquid solid coolants tend to explode because they react with air. But we're not, I think the 2 points that the point I'd like to hammer home about nuclear is it wouldn't actually help that much. As in the real this problem of electrification that Troy was talking about, this problem of getting things onto the electrical grid and then decarbonizing the electrical grid, that's the That's the really hard part, I think. We obviously have to decarbonize the electrical grid. And if you assume very low emissions intensity from mining uranium, then nuclear can be part of that, but it's there are issues there. And I feel like people treat it like a silver bullet, when even if you did build a lot of nuclear power plants, you would still have the big electrification problem. So I think there's a lot of, in the nuclear debate, a lot of hot air goes around. I just don't think it's central the way it tends to be talked about. I kind of wish we didn't even say anything about nuclear in this book to some degree, because I feel like it's a distraction.
No, but I wanted to say something.
Yeah, but that's just my view.
Me and Andreas' mom just really disagree about nuclear, so it's really just to convince him that he's wrong. Do we want to finish either with the game or with the really bad flash mob? What's the
Hans choices.
Okay, we'll do the game.
Right, do you wanna like walk it through?
No, you can
Since
do
have the
it. You
computer?
do it. I have the computer. Oh yeah, it has to be me, doesn't it?
Yeah, it has to be you.
Yeah,
you
well,
gotta
that's
play.
not a choice. Then, do I want to do it? Okay. I'll just do continue because I don't want to go through the. There's a tutorial, but
The tutorial automatically skips now, though, so you can skip it if you've already done it.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all the stuff. I've already started playing a little bit. So down here you have tells you what your land use is based on the current plan, so you know what your trajectory is. Wow, I did awesome. I lowered emissions a lot. And then what happens is you have production. So it starts out with how things are in 2022, and then we went really. I was actually with Andreas, so that's why he loves nuclear. So I went 70% nuclear, and then you can remove various things if you don't like. So you want to get rid of hydro, and then you want to put it all into geothermal, whatever you want, right? Go crazy. That's a limit. Oh man. Okay, because obviously some things have certain. You only can do so much, so many dams. We run out of rivers. Anyways, and then over here we can see all these different things. It's going to tell you what's your energy use and where that technology fits in, what's causing your biodiversity problems and so forth. It tells you a little bit about the technology. There's also these different factions that like or dislike certain technologies, and then so this is the processes. This is you're making electricity. Here for fuel, you have different fuels. It's harder obviously to decarbonize. You have to develop certain technologies, namely green hydrogen, to really get rid of to change things, or to electrify your transportation. And then you can also play around with this. So let's say you want to get rid of your petroleum, and then let's say you want to put it all in biofuels.
That's a bad idea.
Yeah, well, it's not going to be a good plan. And at the bottom, it tells you how long it's going to take. So it's a socialist game, so it's going to be 5-year plans, So 2 planning cycles. So you decrease emissions by 12%, but we increase land use by 10. And water use jumps up a lot. And then let's use some blue. And also it just tells you what it is, right? So what is blue hydrogen? In case you didn't know, it tells you. And then you have crops, you have all this stuff. So if you want to go full, I say go full Pol Pot. So everyone's a peasant. Okay. Too soon? I'm sorry. I don't know. Okay, there we go. Oh, so it's going to cause problems. So okay, well, let's see. Let's just do it anyways. Oh, he really doesn't want us to. There's a limit on how many peasants. That's ridiculous. Okay, and then some organic stuff. Or if you want some stupid vertical farming, you can do that. And then again, it tells you all about it. And then livestock is. Don't have that many options yet. You eventually can get some cell meat. Here's the government. You got these little Muppet things. These represent different factions. So you got you try to ally with the eco-feminists. You can ally with the accelerationists. There's an authoritarian who really doesn't care what you're doing as long as you're using lots of coercion. Is animal liberationist. So basically you will do policies and you will alienate certain factions and you will get certain factions on your side, and hopefully you can pass certain laws. This is kind of like a dashboard and it just tells you what's using up all your land right now, who's eating all your meat, who's what's taking up, what's causing all your emissions. So this also helps you plan, right? So you look at this and you'd be like, well, petroleum's really bad, and I should do something about that. And then you go back and try to change your processes or change your technologies. This tells you, emissions, your warming, how much sea level rise, all this stuff is over here. Is there anything else? And this tells you what's doing what, basically. So again, we're trying to visualize everything. This is the world, so we use the UN's kind of division of the world into 25 regions or something like that, and it just tell you what people are eating, what's their energy use, if they're happy or not. If there's lots of crises in a certain region, they'll become unhappy. You also can do certain things where you can try to have everyone develop and become rich real fast, or you can be an evil Malthusian and just keep the rich world, the north rich and the global south can be poor. You can do all these different things. You also have degrowth in the global north. And then here are some of the policies you can do. So we divided up, He's just telling you what to do. So we have research where you get new technologies, and it takes time. So up here it says the amount of years, and then the more points you put into it, the faster. So over here we put lots of points into breeder reactors, And then you can make a video game if you want. You're getting meta there. And then it'll tell you basically what it does. So it reduces energy demand. It also will unlock other technologies, so you get more cards that you can do. So if you sell meat, maybe you can force people to be vegan. You could try to do that. So again, these are just various technologies, and some are solar, some are nuclear, some are space. You can go to space if you want. If you're one of those space socialists, you can do that. So
technologies always have like an effect. There's no bullshit technologies that you can invest in that don't do anything.
Well, you can try fusion, but I think we gave it a 2% chance of it working. So you can try your luck,
I would say that we try and be as fair as possible throughout the game, although there's some times where there's not a consensus on something, so we have to make up something. But there's a climate model that runs in the game, a real climate model, scientific climate model that actually we compile to WebAssembly and run in the browser so that your decisions actually do run a climate model. And we try and simulate things like nuclear as fairly as possible with the literature. So our low hopes of fusion, that's one of the less objective, or at least trying to cite something parts of the game. We do try and be pretty fair.
Yeah, and there's lots of Malthusian stuff where you can be authoritarian, have a coup. You can do all this crazy stuff. And you can try to have some automation to, as in people work less, but then it takes more energy to run machines, and then you have, what else do we have? We have shock workers will speed up your construction, but then people obviously have to work more, stuff like that. So this is infrastructure. So, and some things are about restoration, some things are about electrification. You can also expand your national parks and try to get to half Earth and all that. And then we have policies, and these could be approved by your parliament, and some things will be blocked off. Where some of the more, see this one, Ren fer cum un bet is, I don't know why this is. This is so controversial compared to being a shock worker. You don't, it's easy to get a vote for that. But so these are policies. So there's, in terms of the game, research will give you sometimes new processes. We'll give you cell meat or give you thorium reactors or whatever that will be in the previous section we looked at. Infrastructure will be something you have to build out over a period of years, and then policies can happen relatively quickly. But they're more controversial, and you need support in Parliament. Again, some groups will support it and some don't. And then so you choose whatever you want, whatever mix of things you want, and then you run the model. And I chose things kind of randomly, so I don't know what's going to... Okay, so this tells you what so indigenous people are running, where their traditional land. This gives you lots of benefits. Oh no, too much oil. That's not good. Mortality rate's high. And then there's some dialogue. And then, so model's running. It was figuring out where they'll have certain. Okay, so we have a terrorist group forming. So if you do certain things, like for example, if you ban meat, you're going to have omnivores forming a terrorist group.
The leather underground. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And thank you. And there's also, if you screw over the global south, you'll get a terrorist group. There's always basically every faction also has a terrorist group. So here we've not been good to the earth. So we're too accelerationists, and now we're getting some environmentalists who are going to blow stuff up. Yeah. So yeah. Oh no. This is so funny. It happens right now. This is kind of. I didn't set this up. Yeah. It's kind of awkward. Yeah. This doesn't always happen. Yeah, exactly. Just keep going. We find those wreckers and destroy them. Okay, we got sell meat going. Great. Blah blah blah. Okay, we got hempcrete. Hempcrete's a real thing. I have a friend who's really into hempcrete. So we have so many things. Okay, Dust Bowl, that sucks. So we get some output drops a lot. Okay, that's enough, farmer. How much you got to say? Okay, this is only the second round. Man, we're just getting rocked. This doesn't always happen. If you do vegan socialism, it's just no. We try to be fair. Geoengineering actually works fairly well in some ways. Okay. Well, I'm trying to get to the report card. So at the end of your 5-year plan, it tells you how you did. So temperature went up, so we lose some points, and the points are basically this like kind of political capital you can invest in your infrastructure or your policies. People are not that content. You got some points. Extinction rate sucks, so lose points. Emissions went up, lose points. You succeeded in doing some programs, so you gain some points. Here are the events. Here are the disasters that happen in different parts of the world, and then you get points based on how you did for the next round. And if you run out of points, then you lose. And that's the game. And you keep playing until they kick you out. People are pissed off at you, or you get to 2100, and then you see what kind of world you created. So it's on our website, half.earth. It's not actually out yet. It'll be out next week. You can play around with it. Let me know what you think. Yeah. So, there's a few other educational games like Drawdown. I don't know if people know Project Drawdown. But that just focuses only on climate and doesn't have all the politics that we also have in this game as well. And we're hoping maybe some undergrads will play it or just people play it for fun. And this is part of the book, right? Because again, as Drew was saying, Neurath is all about having people think about the future and become utopians and think about what kind of futures they want. Hopefully this game helps people do that.
Yeah, that's one thing that's really cool about your group is putting the future back in the hands of people. And I think that's sort of, this game is trying to work towards that sort of goal of the future is ours and we make it. So that's kind of the political ends here.
Yeah. Should we get some... I'm really hungry. Should we get some food? Cool. Any other questions, or should we leave it there? I guess so. Okay. Well, thank you so much.